Good evening and welcome to Spiritual Story Time. I'm Domo Geshe and we are here at Lotus Lake. Tonight is a continuation of Stories of God by Rilke, one of my most favorite authors. He has quite a lovely way. These were written right around 1900, so the language might be a little bit unusual. But I am so enjoying, and I hope you are too, the stories that have come before. So let's see what Rilke has to tell us tonight. The next story is called A Scene from the Ghetto of Venice. Herr Baum, householder, chairman of the borough council, honorary chief of the volunteer fire brigade, and various other things as well. Or, to put it briefly, Herr Baum must have overheard one of my conversations with Ewald. No wonder, to him belongs the house on the ground floor of which my friend lives. Herr Baum and I have known each other by sight for a long time. But the other day, the chairman of the borough council stops, raises his hat a little, so that a small bird could have flown out in the event that one had one caught under it, smiles politely, and opens our acquaintance with the words, "You travel sometimes?" "Oh, yes," I answered rather vaguely. "I very well may." Then he went on confidently, We believe that we are the only two here who have been to Italy." "Indeed," I made an effort to be a little more attentive. "Well, then, of course it is urgently necessary that we should talk together." Herr Baum laughed. "Italy, to be sure, that really is something. I am always telling my children. Take Venice, for example." I stopped. "You still remember Venice?" "But I put it to you," he groaned, for he was rather too stout to become indignant without exertion. "How could I fail to? When once you've seen it, the Piazzetta, don't you agree?" "Yes," I answered. "I remember with particular pleasure the ride through the canal, that soft, soundless gliding along the borders of things past." "The Palazzo Francietti," he exclaimed. "The Chia d'Oro," I rejoined. "The fish market. The Palazzo Vendramin. Where Richard Wagner, he, as a German of culture, hastily added." I nodded. "The Ponte, do you remember?" He smiled, well-oriented. "Of course. And the museum. Not to forget the academy, where a Titian," thus Herr Baum had put himself through a kind of examination, which was rather taxing. I undertook to compensate him with a story, and began forthwith. "When you pass along under the Ponte di Rialto, skirting the Fondaco de Turici and the fish market, and tell your gondolier, 'To the right,' he will look surprised and may even say, 'Dove?' But you insist on going to the right. You leave the gondola in one of the dirty little canals, bargain with the gondolier, tell him what you think of him, and walk away through narrow alleyways and black, smoke-darkened archways, out onto an empty open square. All this for the simple reason that my story takes place there." Herr Baum diffidently touched my arm. "Pardon me, what story?" His small eyes darted hither and thither in some anxiety. I reassured him. "Oh, just a little story, my dear sir, nothing remarkable at all. I cannot even tell you when it happened. Perhaps under Doge Alvise Monecchio IV, but it may also have been somewhat earlier or somewhat later. Carpaccio's pictures, if you happen to have seen some of them, look as though they were painted on purple velvet. Everywhere something warm, sylvan as it were, breaks through and around the subdued lights in their listening shadows crowd. Giorgine painted on dull, aging gold, Titian on black satin. But at the time of which I speak, light pictures were in favor, done on a ground of white silk, and the name that was toyed with, that lovely lips threw out into the sunlight and charming ears caught up as it fell quivering down. That name is Gian Battista Tiepolo. But all of this does not come into my story. Only the real Venice is concerned, the city of palaces, of adventures, of masks and pale nights on the lagoon which carry like no other nights the sound of clandestine romances. In the bit of Venice of which I shall tell, there are only poor, ordinary sounds. The days passed monotonously over it, as though they were but a single day, and the songs one hears there are swelling plates that do not mount upward but settle like curling smoke over the alleys. As soon as twilight comes, much furtive humanity mills about in the streets. Countless children have their homes upon the squares and in the narrow, cold doorways and play with chips and leavings of vari-colored, glassy flux, the same from which the masters piece together the stern mosaics of San Marco. A noble seldom finds his way into the ghetto. Only when the Jewish maidens gather at the well, one may sometimes notice a figure, black, in cloak and mask. Certain people know by experience that this figure carries a dagger hidden in those folds. Somebody is supposed to have seen the young man's face once in the moonlight, and since then they declare this dark, slim visitor to be Marcantonio Priali, son of the Proventore Niccolo Priili and the beautiful Caterina Manelli. It is known that he waits under the porch of Isaac Rosso's house, then, when people are gone, walks straight across the square and enters the house of old Melchizedek, the wealthy goldsmith, who has many sons and 7 daughters, and by his sons and daughters, many grandchildren. Esther, the youngest granddaughter, awaits him, leaning against her aged grandsire's shoulder in a low, dark chamber in which many objects glitter and glow, and silk and velvet hang soft over the costly vessels, as though to quench their full golden flames. Here Marcantonio sits on a silver-embroidered cushion at the feet of the venerable Jew and tells of Venice as he would tell a fairy tale that never anywhere happened quite like that. He tells of the theater, of battles fought by the Venetian army, of foreign visitors, of pictures and statues, of the Sensa on Ascension Day, of the Carnival, and of the beauty of his mother, Caterina Manelli. All these have for him much the same meaning, being different expressions of power and love and life. To his 2 listeners, it is all strange, for the Jews are strictly excluded from all society but their own, and even the wealthy old Melchizedek never sets foot within the domains of the Great Council, although as a goldsmith and because of the general respect in which he is held, he might have dared to do so. In the course of his long life, the old man had obtained from the Great Council many privileges for his co-religionists, who looked upon him as a father. But again and again he had to endure the rebound. Every time a calamity befell the state, vengeance was taken on the Jews. The Venetians themselves were much too kin with them in spirit to use them, as other nations did, for commercial purposes. They plagued them with taxes, robbed them of their possessions, and restricted the boundary of the ghetto more and more, so that the Jewish families, which in the midst of all their hardships increased fruitfully, were forced to build their houses up into the air, one upon the roof of the other. And their city, which did not lie by the sea, thus slowly grew up into the sky as into another sea. And around the square with the well, the steep buildings rose on all sides, like the walls of some giant tower. The wealthy Melchizedek, in the eccentricity of old age, had made an odd proposal to his fellow citizens, sons and grandsons. He wished always to inhabit whichever was the highest of these tiny houses, pushing upward, one above the other, in countless stories. This strange desire was readily granted, for no one trusted the sustaining power of the lower walls anyway, and such light bricks were set upon them that the wind did not seem to notice the walls at all. So the old man would move 2 or 3 times a year, and Esther, who refused to leave him, always with him. In the end, they were so high that when they stepped from their confinement of their room out onto the flat roof, there began at the level of their eyes another country, of the customs of which the old man would speak in dark words, half psalmodizing. It was a long way up to them now, through the lives of many strangers, over steep and slippery steps, past scolding women and the onslaughts of hungry children that the way led. And its many obstacles restricted all intercourse. Even Marcantonio no longer came to visit, and Esther hardly missed him. In the hours when she had been alone with him, she had looked at him so large-eyed and so long that it seemed to her that he had plunged deep into her dark eyes and died, and that now there was a beginning in herself, his new everlasting life, in which he, as a Christian, had of course believed. With this new feeling in her young body, she would stand all day on the roof, seeking the sea. But high though her house might be, there were only to be seen the gable of the Palazzo Foccasi, some tower or another, the cupola of a church, a more distant cupola that seemed to shiver in the light, and then a lattice of masts, beams, poles, against the rim of the humid, quivering sky. Towards the end of that summer, the old man, though the climbing was already hard for him, despite all protests, moved once more, for a new hut, high above all, had been built. As he crossed the square again after so long a time, leaning on Esther's arm, people gathered round him and bent low over his fumbling hands and begged for his advice in many matters, for he was to them like one dead who rises from his grave because a certain time is fulfilled. And so indeed it seemed. The men told him that there was a revolt in Venice, the nobles were in danger, and soon the boundaries of the ghetto would fall, and all would enjoy the same freedom. The old man answered nothing, and only nodded as though all this had long been known to him, and much more besides. He entered the house of Isaac Rosso, on the very top of which his new abode was perched, and spent half a day climbing the stairs. Up there, Esther bore a delicate blonde child. When she had recovered, she took it in her arms and out upon the roof, and for the first time let its open eyes be filled with the whole golden sun. It was an autumn morning of indescribable clearness. Things had a dusty look, almost without luster. Only now and then flying lights would settle on them, as on large blossoms, rest a while, and then soar away over the golden line of their contours in the sky. And there, where they disappeared, one caught sight from this highest spot of that which no one had ever seen from the ghetto before, a still and silvery light, the sea. And only now, when Esther's eyes had grown accustomed to the glory, did she notice at the roof's very edge Melchizedek. He rose with outspread arms, forcing his dim eyes to gaze into the slowly unfolding day. His arms remained uplifted, a radiant thought upon his brow. It was as though he were offering a sacrifice. Then he leaned forward again and again and pressed his venerable head upon the rough, jagged stones. The people stood assembled on the square below, gazing up at him. Here and there words and gestures rose out of the crowd, but they did not reach to the old man praying in solitude. And the people saw their oldest and their youngest as in the clouds. The old man continued, rising proudly to his feet, and then anew falling prostrate in humility. For a long time he continued, and the crowd below grew and did not let him out of their sight. Had he seen the sea, or God, the eternal, in his glory? Herrbaum endeavored to say something quickly, but he did not at once succeed. The sea probably, he then said dryly, it really is impressive, whereby he showed himself to be particularly enlightened and sensible. I hastily bade him goodbye, but I could not refrain from calling after him. Don't forget to tell your children this incident. He thought for a moment. The children? But you know that young nobleman, that Antonio, or whatever his name is, he is not at all a nice character. And then the baby, that baby, that seems rather for children. Oh, I reassured him, you have forgotten, my dear sir, that all babies come from God. Why should the children wonder that Esther had one, since she lived so near the sky? This story, too, the children have heard. And when you ask them what they think it may have been that the old Jew Melchizedek saw in his ecstasy, they say without stopping to think, oh, the sea, too. You know, there's times right now for so many people are so difficult. And while I was reading this story, and I read the news too much, I think, and I thought, oh, I hope he doesn't fall from the roof. I hope that the baby isn't dropped. And so I read with a certain hesitancy, and then at the end I noticed that it was Rilke, and he would never do such a thing. He would never hurt my feelings that way, and I would never hurt your feelings that way. So I'm so glad that story turned out well. Maybe it didn't turn out well, and it just, at that moment, it turned out well. That would be very Rilke, wouldn't it? Like that. I think we have time for another. This one is called Of One Who Listened to the Stones. I am with my lame friend again. He smiles in his characteristic way. And about Italy you have never told me yet, which means I am about to make up for it as soon as I can. Ewald nods and has already closed his eyes to listen. So I begin. What we feel as spring God sees as a fleeting little smile passing over the earth. Earth seems to be remembering something. In summer, she tells everyone about it until she grows wiser in the great autumnal silence, through which she confides in those who are lonely. All the springs you and I have lived through, put together, still do not suffice to fill a single one of God's seconds. A spring, for God to notice it, may not remain in trees and on the meadows. It must somehow manifest its strength in man, for then it will proceed, as it were, not within time, but rather in eternity and in God's presence. Once when this happened, God's glance must have been hovering in their dark wings over Italy. The country down there was bathed in light, the century itself shining like gold, but right across it, like a dark path, lay the shadow of a sturdy man, heavy and black, and far before it the shadow of his creating hands, restless, twitching, now over Pisa, now over Naples, now dissolving over the vague motion of the sea. God could not take his eyes from those hands, which at first seemed to him folded, like praying hands, but the prayer that welled forth from them forced them far apart. A silence fell in the heavens. All the saints followed God's gaze, and like him, watched the shadow that hid half Italy, and the hymns of the angels froze upon their lips, and the stars trembled, for they feared to have done some wrong, and waited humbly for God's angry word. But nothing of this kind happened. The heavens had opened in their whole breadth over Italy, so that Raphael was on his knees in Rome, while the blessed Fra Angelico of Fiesole stood on a cloud and rejoiced over him. Many prayers were at that hour on their way from the earth, but God recognized only one thing. The strength of Michelangelo rose up to him like a fragrance of vineyards, and he suffered it to fill his thoughts. He bent lower, found the striving man, looked beyond his shoulder at the hands that hovered, listening about the stone, and started. Did the very stones have souls? Why was this man listening to the stones? And now the hands awoke and tore at the stones as at a grave in which a faint dying voice is flickering. "Michelangelo," cried God in dread, "who is in that stone?" Michelangelo listened. His hands were trembling. Then he answered in a muffled voice, "Thou, my God, who else? But I cannot reach thee." And then God sensed that he was indeed in the stone, and he felt fearful and confined. The whole sky was but a stone, and he locked in its midst, hoping for the hands of Michelangelo to deliver him. And he heard them coming, as though yet afar. But the master was at work again. He thought continually, thou art but a little block, and some one else might scarcely find one figure in thee. But I feel a shoulder here. It is that of Joseph of Arimathea, and here Mary bends down. I sense the trembling of her hands that support Jesus, our Lord, who has just died on the cross. If in this little block of marble there is room for these three, why should I not sometime lift a whole sleeping race out of a rock? And with the broad strokes he set free the three figures of the Pietà, but he did not lift the veils of stones entirely from their faces, as though he feared that their deep sorrow might lay a numbness on his hands. So he fled to another stone, but each time he lacked courage to give a brow its full serenity, a shoulder its perfect curve, nor when he made a woman did he lay the ultimate smile about her lips, lest her beauty might be all betrayed. At that time he was designing the monument for Julius de la Rovere. He thought to build a mountain over the Iron Pope and a race of men therewith to people the mountain. Filled with many dim plans, he went out to his marble quarries. The mountainside rose steep above a poor village, surrounded by olive trees and weather-beaten rock. The newly broken surfaces of stone appeared like a great pale face under aging hair. Long Michelangelo stood before that veiled brow. Suddenly he perceived before it two enormous eyes of stone watching him, and Michelangelo felt his own stature grow under the influence of that look. Now he too towered over the land. It seemed to him that since the beginning of time, he and this mountain have been brothers. The valley receded below him as under one climbing, the little huts crowded together like herds of cattle, and the great face of rock under its white stone veils appeared ever nearer and more kin. It had a waiting expression, motionless and yet on the verge of motion. Michelangelo pondered, "Thou canst not be hewn asunder, for thou indeed art but one." And then he lifted up his voice. "Thee I will complete, thou art my task." And he turned back toward Florence. He saw a star and the tower of Duomo, and about his feet was evening. Of a sudden, at the Porta Romana, he hesitated. The 2 rows of houses reached out to him like arms, and already they had taken hold of him and were drawing him into the town. And ever narrower and more dusky the streets became, and as he entered his house, he knew himself to be in mysterious hands, from which he could not escape. He fled into the hall and thence into the low chamber, scarcely 2 paces long, in which he was wont to write. Its walls leaned in upon him, and it was as though they fought with his enormousness and forced him back into his old restricted form. And he endured it. He fell upon his knees and let himself be shaped by them. He felt a never-known humility within him, and himself longed somehow to be small. And there came a voice, "Michelangelo, who is in thee?" And the man in the narrow chamber laid his head heavily upon his hands and softly said, "Thou, my God, who else?" And all became wide around God, and he freely lifted up his face that was all over Italy, and looked about him. In mantles and mitres the saints stood there, and the angels with their songs, as with vessels filled at radiant springs, went about among the thirsting stars, and to the heavens there was no end. My lame friend looked up and suffered the evening clouds to draw his gaze with them along the sky. "But is God there?" he asked. I was silent. Then I bent forward toward him. "Ewald, are we really here?" and warmly we clasped hands. I like that one a lot. It feels really sincere and loving, doesn't it? And without agenda. Tomorrow we'll continue with Rilke until the end of the book. Have a lovely evening. Be happy. Meditate. Good night.